Hello Internet, TheStabbyBrit here. I know I've been a bit lazy on the old content front lately, so I thought I'd ease my way back into it with a response video. And this is going to be a response video to Eckhart's Ladder. They did a Warship Classes of the Imperium of Man video. Now, I took issue with this because while it's vaguely right in the broad strokes, some of the things they got wrong just really grated on my fanboy nerves. So I thought I'd go through and point out some of the things they got wrong, and some of the things they missed, because why the hell not? So Eckhart's video started with what they classified as attack craft, and I don't know what definition they were using, but it doesn't seem to be a very good one, because very early in the video, we got this gem.
Some fighters, like the Marauder Bomber, are also used primarily in atmosphere, while others are vacuum only.
The Marauder Bomber is not a fighter. The Marauder Bomber is a bomber. That's why it's called the Marauder Bomber, and not the Marauder Fighter. So what I think Eckhart has done is they've just taken all the small things in the Imperial Navy and called them attack craft, universally, and then decided that everything below a certain size is a fighter, which is a bloody stupid way of doing things because that's not how it actually works. The Marauder is an example of a Navy atmospheric craft. While these are part of the Imperial Navy, if we're looking at capital ship scale stuff, these essentially should not be considered. In terms of void warfare, they do not exist. They have to stay right on top of the carrier ship if they can be launched at all. And they're only there, essentially, to perform planetary assault missions. They can be dropped into atmosphere. Some of them have the means of going from atmosphere back into space, such as the Thunderbolt pictured here. The Lightning Interceptor can also do this. But these ships do not operate anywhere near the scale of actual void-borne warships of any size. I mean, a Fury Interceptor is larger than an atmospheric bomber. So it's important we acknowledge these things exist, but for the rest of the video, ignore them. They might as well not exist. The smaller ships worth looking at here are collectively known as attack craft, and they can be split into interceptors, bombers, and assault boats. Interceptors exist to stop the other two, basically, along with torpedoes and similar ordnance. They act as fighters on a naval scale, but, as I say, they are just massive, clumsy beasts which could not operate as a fighter in atmosphere. The Fury is crewed by 2 to 4 people. They have a shitload of las cannons and missiles. They're great fun, and they can roam for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of kilometers away from the parent craft. Then you have the Starhawk, which uses a selection of big guns and bombs. Some of them can even carry naval-grade torpedoes, which is great fun. They are extremely dangerous to capital ships, and not very dangerous for anything else, because these things are not going to hit anything smaller than a Star Destroyer, for those of you who aren't familiar with 40k. And then there's the Shark Assault Boat, which is simply a giant battering ram full of soldiers that you plough headlong into whatever you want to board and brutally murder in close combat. So with our attack craft taken care of, it's time to move up the ranks a little bit.
Unsurprisingly, the next largest class of ships in the Imperium's Navy generally performs starfighter screening duties.
And this is why it's important to get your terminology right, because that's wrong. The role of an escort is not to screen against fighters. Fighters can't do jack shit to a capital ship. Bombers can, absolutely. But an escort isn't going to screen against a bomber. They're too vulnerable to dedicated bomber waves. They can be crippled and destroyed easily by massed squadrons of Starhawks. Furies are there to get rid of those. The role of the escort ships, destroyers and frigates, is completely different. Anyway, let's let you say your piece, and then I'll carry on.
And usually take the form of escorts or frigates. Again, like in Star Wars or other universes, the main function of these ships is not to engage large cruisers, but to protect heavy friendly vessels, which often have much slower weapons. As you might expect, escort ships are often expended in extremely high numbers, much like frontline Imperial Guardsmen. Some escorts would also be specialized for carrying fighters, others for supporting ground attacks, etc., etc.
Tell me, fellow 40k fans, are you seeing why I took issue with this video yet? How much of that was actually right? I don't think any of it was. So I'm going to go back and pick through that piece by piece and point out where the inaccuracies are.
And usually take the form of escorts or frigates.
A frigate is an escort. Escorts are simply any ship that is of a sufficient size or lack thereof. I think you meant to say destroyers and frigates, which are the two most common examples of an escort class.
Again, like in Star Wars or other universes, the main function of these ships is not to engage large cruisers.
This is correct. The function of an escort is to protect the vulnerable flanks and rear of bigger ships. Their job is to scout. They can set ambushes. They can weigh in with supporting fire. Or indeed, they can attack battleships. Now that might sound insane, right? But it's not. Because escorts are small, fast ships. And battleships, as we'll cover later, are big, clumsy, slow ships. Escorts could, in theory, get behind a battleship and just blaze away at it for days and days and days and cripple it or destroy it. It's not necessarily a good idea, mind, because you have to get behind the guy first, and any enemy commander worth his rank pins is going to know his battleships are vulnerable to this kind of escort ambush attack, and he's going to have escorts of his own and other ships to keep your escorts off. But they're there. It could be done. Other useful roles of an escort is to harass enemy supply ships, because escorts are small and fast. Their general role, essentially, is to do everything short of act like a ship of the line.
But to protect heavy friendly vessels, which often have much slower weapons.
No, they have much slower engines. They have a much wider turning circle. I mean, we're talking about ships that are the size of a small city. The smallest vessel in 40k, on this scale at least, is the Cobra Destroyer, which is the size of an Imperial Star Destroyer from Star Wars. That's the smallest Imperial Navy vessel. So, a ship of the line is 3 to 4 times that size, maybe even 5 times that size. These things are massive, and battleships are even bigger. And they also tend to be travelling at really ludicrous speeds. So, you've got something the size of a city, moving at incredible velocity, and you want it to change direction. And more importantly, you want all of it to change direction, because it's really quite easy to make bits of a ship go another way. But if you want the whole thing to stay together, you've got to be really careful about how and when you fire your thrusters. And essentially that means that cruisers aren't very agile at all, and battleships are basically planets. These things don't dodge, and that's the point of the escort. It's not that battleships take a long time to charge up the super laser like in Star Wars, because Star Wars ships are crap and 40k ships aren't. A battleship will quite happily fire just as fast, if not faster, than an escort. The problem is it's so much harder to get its guns into the correct firing position.
As you might expect, escort ships are often expended in extremely high numbers.
Oh no, they are not, sir. There is no such thing as an expendable vessel in 40k. Every single ship, from the mightiest Gloriana class to the lowliest Cobra Destroyer, is a work of artifice. These things are priceless relics, quite often, and even the newest ship is treated with care and reverence. There are so few ships comparatively in the Imperial Navy. This is something that people forget. The Imperium is massive, but there aren't nearly as many ships to keep it all together as you might think. I mean, a battle group covering a sector. I mean, the Gothic sector had less than 200 capital ships. And I don't know how many escorts it had. We don't know. But we're probably looking at low thousands for total number of actual military-grade assault craft that could, actually go out and hunt other fleets and engage in open warfare. There is no such thing as an expendable ship. More escorts are lost, absolutely. But by the same token, there are more escorts. There are more escorts than any other class of ship. There are probably more escorts than all of the classes of ship combined. And, being the smallest ship, they are also the most fragile. But no, absolutely not. No Imperial Navy commander would willingly throw away a single vessel, let alone expending thousands of irreplaceable warships.
Escorts would also be specialized for carrying fighters, others for supporting ground attacks, etc., etc.
Well, I guess this is true. I mean, I'm not sure about carrying fighters, but, Q ships were a thing. Generally speaking, there are 3 roles an escort will fill. These are exemplified by the Cobra destroyer, which acts as a sort of a torpedo gunboat. It has other weapons, but its main armament is its torpedo bay. The role of the Cobra is essentially to get around the flanks and rear of bigger ships, lob a lot of very powerful ordnance at them, and run the hell away. The Cobra cannot engage head-on. Frankly, it can't even win a fight with other escorts. But it's very dangerous in groups to capital ships. Then you have the Sword, which is the best all-round example of an Imperial escort. It's just got a mass load of gun batteries. It's got macro cannons, which fire big shells. It's got plasma weapons. It's got lasers. It's good all round. It can essentially blow up pirate ships with ease. In large numbers, it can threaten capital ships, but it's not great at fighting them. It can overwhelm lesser escorts like the Cobra. It's a good example of what an escort is meant to be. And then you've got the Firestorm, which is a specialized anti-capital ship escort again. Instead of torpedoes, though, it uses a lance battery, which is essentially a massive laser cannon. Now, the Firestorm, I would argue, is a bit more all-rounder than the Cobra. The Cobra's torpedoes mean it's unsuitable for use against other escorts, whereas a lance battery can work against other escorts, especially if it's got some swords and similar to back it up. Essentially, the downside of a lance battery is it's incredibly powerful, but it takes a long time to recharge. And if the opposing ship has sufficiently strong shields, their shields can heal before you can get the next lance shot off. So, obviously, the Firestorm is meant to work similar way to the Cobra, ideally with support. But that's essentially the 3 key examples, and there are others. There are a lot of escorts, but that's the 3 general roles. You've got your gunboats, your torpedo boats, and your lance boats. And they all have sort of similar roles, which overlap to some extent.
However, the backbone of the Imperium's navy was cruisers, medium-sized ships which...
Again, just for clarity's sake, I want to put an asterisk there. Medium-sized in 40k terms. Okay, these things will basically dwarf the vast majority of the Star Wars universe. And everything in Star Trek. Aside from maybe that crazy whale probe thing. There really isn't much in Star Trek that matches up to 40k scale. Sorry Trek fanboys, I know you think that the Borg are all that, but no, the Borg are utterly screwed if they dare stray into the screaming abyss that is the warp rift leading to the 40k crossover universe. Anyway, on to cruisers.
However, the backbone of the Imperium's navy was cruisers, medium-sized ships which, like frigates or corvettes, could be highly customized, depending on both intended purpose and the location of the ship's construction.
I suppose that's fair. There's nothing really to take issue with there, although I will point out that there is a shift that occurred in Imperial Navy doctrine that impacted the design aesthetics and the functionality of Imperial Navy ships. Essentially, what most people think of as chaos ships are... I want to call them early Imperial ships, but they're not, for reasons that needs its own video. But essentially there were two schools of thought with the Imperial Navy ships. You could either have ones that are fast and that engage at long range with conventional weapons, or you have ones which are a bit slower, but they've got a bloody big ramming prow and a huge cannon or lots of torpedo bays on the front, and you sacrifice long range hitting power for the ability to just form up, hit somebody with a massive barrage of explosives or a Nova cannon, and then ram whatever survives. The former fell out of favour, and strangely enough, a lot of those ships turned to chaos for some reason, and the latter is what we think of as the Imperial Navy. Anyway, that was a big aside. Moving swiftly on.
Due to the simplicity of design, the Lunar-class cruiser was perhaps the most common ship in the Imperium. Unlike some smaller vessels, the Lunar possessed void shields and medium-range anti-capital ship weapons.
Whoa, hang on. I take issue with this because I've just clicked what you're implying here. You're bringing up shields now. The way you phrase that, it implies that escorts don't have shields. They absolutely do. Attack craft don't have shields. Even the Cobra has shields. I mean, the way you phrase this is really, really misleading. And it's quite disappointing to hear. I mean, you're right about the Lunar class being common. And I'm having a hard time actually explaining this clearly. Partly because I want to explain this for people who maybe don't know 40k very well, and partly because that shot of Jaeger I had earlier was just kicked in. But essentially, the Imperium is split into 5 segmentum. They're different sizes. They're sometimes thought of as like quarters of the galaxy, but that's not quite right. But essentially, one of the segmentum had over 600 Lunar class cruisers in during a campaign in the setting called the Gothic War. And if we go by that, that means about 20% of the Imperium had 600 Lunar class cruisers in it. And these things are incredibly common. I mean, the Gothic War alone, which was quite big, had more than 20 of them. So, yeah, the Lunar class is really common, and it's a really awesome ship. I could probably ramble about that considerably. But essentially, yes. I don't like the fact you implied that smaller ships don't have shields. They do. Anything that could be considered a ship has a void shield. Excuse me. So, we'll let you move. Carry on, please.
As well as specialized long-range lances. We see the configurability of cruisers with the Dictator line.
Sorry, I just need to step in. The Lunar does not have long-range lances. The Lunar has either short or medium-range guns, depending on how you want to define ranges. But realistically, no one would classify the Lunar's weaponry as long-range. In fact, I'll just go through the Lunar, because it is a nice template for what a Imperial cruiser is. The Lunar class cruiser, from prow to stern, has a forward ramming prow. Big, nice chunk of adamantium, thicker than your house. Nothing is getting through that. You can fire at that for days and you will achieve squat. It's got a torpedo room hidden behind that, which can launch up to 6 torpedoes at a time. And these are basically 200-foot long devices with some sort of plasma warhead. No idea what that actually means. Maybe it's a fusion reactor. That would be kind of funny, actually. These torpedoes, they have a basic guidance system on board, which means that they can lock onto targets which are about 50 to 100,000 kilometers away. Which is point blank, by the way. I mean, 50 to 100,000 kilometers in Imperial Navy doctrine is firing over iron sights. So that gives you an idea of the kind of scale we're working at here. It then has the broadsides, which are split into 2 gun decks. The forward gun decks are macro cannons, usually, or possibly plasma batteries. They're referred to collectively as weapon batteries. These are weapons that fire relatively slow, and again, relatively. The word relatively will come up a lot, because these things are meant to be used at ranges, we're talking like 60,000 kilometers, or more, potentially. The exact scale depends on the story and the who's telling it. I've seen some sources which suggest millions of kilometers. But the point is, this ship will sit on one side of a planet and fire at something on the other side of the planet, or possibly on the other side of the planet's farthest moon. And these volleys might take hours to hit their target. So they have to be led, which sounds a bit crazy, but there you go. And the fact the Imperial Navy can hit anything at all using that firing style is a testament to how bloody good they are at their jobs, or possibly how much ordnance they're actually putting out into the void. And then we've got the Lancers, which was mentioned in Eckhart's video. As I hinted at before, these are massive energy weapons, and our Luna has 2 of these on each broadside. Lancers are amazing weapons because they are a point-and-click gun. And I mentioned weapon batteries have to be led. Torpedoes have to be led because their lock-on is such short range. Lancers don't. If you're in range of this thing, you just point it at the enemy ship and it hits. And they are so powerful that armor is virtually no protection. I mean, to give an example, if you were to point a lance battery at, I'm going to use Star Wars because this, it's a well-known franchise. You point a lance battery at a Star Destroyer, and you fire a lance at it. The lance hits the front of the ship, cores through the ship, goes out the back end, goes through the Star Destroyer behind that one, and probably takes out the one behind that one as well. You do not want to be on the receiving end of a lance strike. Even a glancing hit will cause catastrophic damage. The downside of this weapon is it takes an incredibly long time to charge. And 40k being 40k, we could be talking potentially hours between charges. Because as I mentioned, this is a setting where you have to fire ahead of your target. You fire your plasma cannon and you take out a stopwatch and say, okay, in about 14 minutes, there might be a really big energy flash over there, and if there is, that means we hit the target. So, we're definitely talking a long recharge time. And the problem with that is, as I mentioned before, shields. Shields are the bane of Lancers, because they will overload a shield just as well as they will core through a hull. But the problem is, if you fire your Lancers and you burn off the enemy shields, if you don't have anything to follow up with, you're in trouble. And this is what makes the Luna brilliant. Because a Luna class, or quite often a pair of Luna class cruisers, will close on an enemy vessel, and they will engage with their macro cannons and their plasma cannons, their weapon batteries, and they will pound the enemy for hours with their weapons. Wait until the shields collapse, and once the shields go down, they will fire with their Lancers. And now the enemy ship, which might be well armoured, because quite a few enemy vessels are well armoured, those Lancers will just core through it and cause catastrophic damage, crippling, if not destroying, the enemy vessel in a single volley. And that's what makes the Luna so good. That's why there are over 600 of these things per segmentum. They are god-tier vessels. Not because they are individually the most powerful ship around. I mean, there are, in any given role, there's a ship that does what the Luna does better. The difference is that the Luna is an all-rounder, and in 40k, being an all-rounder is actually a really, really good thing. It's why other vessels have come and gone, and yet the Luna remains so dominant. But anyway, we were talking about the We were talking about the carrier, weren't we? Let's just go back to that.
Long-range lances. We see the configurability of cruisers with the Dictator line, which was built with the same hull of the Lunar, but instead traded long-range weaponry for fighter carrying. As Ships of the Adeptus Mechanicus explains, a single Dictator with a handful of escorts proved an exceedingly flexible force, capable of running down pirates and raiding hostile worlds with waves of attack craft.
That sounds about right. In fact, the Dictator highlights a problem I have with the Imperial Navy, in that it seems the Dictator was mostly built from Lunar-class hulls. The Lunars would take battle damage, the Lancers would be wrecked, and they desperately needed something. They often needed an escort ship, so they put launch bays on as a stopgap measure and sent them on escort duties, protecting convoys. And they were really good at it, as this video mentions. And I don't understand why this was such a revelation. Because it seems bloody obvious that if you have a ship that can house hundreds or possibly thousands of attack craft, you're going to make mincemeat of pirates who are mostly using small vessels. I mean, there's no way in hell a pirate raider is going to stand up to a squadron of Starhawk bombers, as I mentioned when talking about escorts earlier. And if something bigger comes along, I mean, if somehow they're not scared, it's a cruiser. It's got gun batteries designed to knock out capital ships. It's got masses of torpedoes. It's a beast. And in a full-on fleet engagement, it's equally awesome. It can form a second-line ship. The necessity of the Dictator is blatantly obvious to anyone with half a brain, and yet for some reason, the Imperial Navy, do you know what it is? It's 40k's equivalent of the Tarkin Doctrine from Star Wars, when the Empire in Star Wars did the same thing. They decided that starfighters were crap, and that, actually you want big capital ships. And then they act surprised when the Rebel Alliance relies on really solid attack craft and just wipes them out time and again and blows up the Death Star, and the bit from the latest one where they take out a dreadnought. It's the exact same thing. The Empire from Star Wars and the Imperial Navy in 40k both have this glaring blind spot where they've convinced themselves attack craft aren't very good for some reason. Why? Anyway, so there we go. We've got a bit of commonality, and this is a part of the video I like. I'm glad the Dictator was brought up, because I do love me some Dictators.
Although cruiser was a fairly broad term, the category could be further subdivided based on tonnage, and generally a cruiser would be described as light, medium, or heavy. However, there were also battle cruisers, arguably a distinct class, representing a transition between general cruisers and larger ship types. Battle cruisers were almost solely used for direct assaults, with massive amount of power pushed to weapons and extraordinarily deadly armaments like Nova cannons very common.
That seems a reasonable assessment. The vessels mentioned so far, the Lunar and the Dictator, are a cruiser, a standard cruiser, a ship of the line, if you like. There were light cruisers, like the Dauntless class, and the distinction generally is that a light cruiser is faster, it doesn't have as much armor, it's smaller, it's meant to act as a reconnaissance craft and a scout. The thing to keep in mind is a technology in the 40k universe is generally lacking, comparatively. I mean, you won't really find a world in 40k where there are constant streams of ships flying in and out. It's more like the Age of Sail, where you might see a lot of ships clustered around a port, but once you leave port, you're on your own. And a lot of the time, a light cruiser is all you need, because all you need to establish dominance is to turn up in a ship. And light cruisers are great for that. The category of heavy cruiser is a weird one, because heavy cruisers and battle cruisers appear to be the same thing. Why there's a distinction, I don't know. It comes from Battlefleet Gothic, where Chaos have heavy cruisers and the Imperial Navy have battle cruisers, but essentially they're the same thing. Essentially, a heavy cruiser and a battle cruiser are a regular cruiser with bigger guns, with battleship-grade armaments. Their defining characteristic tends to be that their weapons have longer range and that they have dorsal-mounted guns. This is strange, really. I don't know why the Imperium doesn't do this more, because during the Third War of Armageddon campaign, we saw the Armageddon class cruiser. And once again, this is a lunar class. It is literally a lunar class, and what they did was, they took a damaged lunar class and they just went to town on it. They went, okay, put bigger guns on that. Just make the macro cannons bigger. Put more plasma reactors on board so that the plasma cannons can go further. Put better lances on board. Put more lances on board. Just more guns on the lunar. And somehow they were able to do that without losing anything else. It doesn't have less... It's got the same amount of point defense turrets, it's got the same shields, it's got the same speed. So they must have upgraded the engines as well, because this is a bigger, heavier ship. It's obviously heavier, it's got bigger guns, and it's got more guns. And that is it. There doesn't appear to be any canonical downside to a battlecruiser. It's objectively better in every single way. And then there are Grand Cruisers, which are a bit weird. I think you bring them up... I'll talk about Grand Cruisers in a minute. Let's just see what this video has to say about battlecruisers.
The Mars battlecruiser was perhaps the most prevalent ship of this category.
No. Look, I am a huge Mars-class fanboy, because as far as I'm concerned, the Mars is the perfect ship. You've got gun batteries, you've got lance turrets, you've got a Nova cannon, and you've got launch decks. Launch decks? Launch bays. Flight decks. Whatever. You've got the means of throwing lots of things out in every direction. You can do everything with a Mars class. It's the ultimate all-rounder. It's even more of an all-rounder than the Lunar class. But to say they are common is flat out wrong. I mean, as far as 40k lore is concerned, they're obsolete. They haven't been built for 3,000 years. Every single surviving Mars class is a relic of a former age, because the Imperial Navy, once again, the Tarkin Doctrine in effect, they've decided it's undergunned. Yes, that's 40k in a nutshell. Hey guys, I've got a warship that has a massive Gauss cannon on the prow. It's so powerful, it has to be center-lined, because the recoil, if it was put on a broadside, would rip the ship in half. And this thing will create a implosion sphere tens of thousands of kilometers across that will literally crush everything in its path. This thing will destroy a 5-kilometer long space station in a single cataclysmic implosion. Sorry, no, that ship's undergunned. Replace it. Yeah. No. Mars class is objectively the best ship the Imperium ever made, bar none. The Lunar class and its bigger brother, the Armageddon class, being the only ships that can compete. But it is not common. No. No battleship is common. The Overlord might have been a better choice if you wanted an example battlecruiser. But no, sorry, I do need to correct that.
And often led fleets. There's also the somewhat antiquated Grand Cruiser class. Grand Cruisers were large, powerful, and blunt. However, because of their age, were often unreliable and difficult to repair. It seems like the Imperium has generally stopped producing Grand Cruisers and instead focused on battle cruisers. Finally,
yeah, that's pretty much true. The reason for this is a Grand Cruiser. Generally speaking, there's a variant which the Chaos fleets have, which doesn't really stick to this rule. The Repulsive class, which is the picture they used, is a half-decent ship, in fairness. But most Grand Cruisers we know about have a major design flaw, and that's they are broadsiders. The idea of a Grand Cruiser was it was a massive ship with a massive broadside, up to or exceeding battleship level broadsides. And they would just plough forwards, come alongside the enemy, and obliterate them in a storm of all flavours of high explosive goodness. And I think a couple had launch bays. I don't know why, because frankly, putting launch bays on a ship with no forward guns, that's the only thing I can think of that's close to as stupid as not using any kind of carrier at all. But basically, the Imperial Navy cottoned on very quickly that Grand Cruisers weren't very good at their job. They didn't have the forward armor they needed to trudge slowly forwards through enemy fire. Their broadsides were formidable, but they were too big, too slow, too heavy. What they did could be achieved better by using a smaller ship with a more well-rounded armament, using more ships. Basically, the Grand Cruiser didn't fit into any kind of sensible Imperial Navy doctrine, and so they were scrapped. Yes, I have referred to the idea of sensible Imperial Navy doctrine. I know some people will find that hard to pass, but there you go. Really, the only thing left to touch on with this video is the reference to the Gloriana class, where it says only 20 remain. That's completely wrong. Only 20 were ever built. The Gloriana might not exist at all in 40k anymore. These are insanely huge vessels. I believe the Ultramarines have one, I think. The Eternal Crusader of the Black Templars may or may not be a Gloriana class, depending on who you ask and what edition the source comes from. And I've heard people claim there's another one floating around. So, these are monster ships. I mean, these are the superstar destroyers of the 40k universe, the difference being that the Gloriana is actually worth using. So, yeah, they are titanic monsters that defy classification and are unfathomably huge and powerful ships. But that's about it for this video and the things I wanted to poke holes in. I look forward to poking holes in other people's content soonish. Maybe tomorrow, who knows. Anyway, the nice warm glow of Jägermeister has gone away now, so I guess I'll wrap this video up. Well done to everyone who made it this far, and who knows, if there's actually any interest whatsoever in this topic, I might do a deeper dive into the Imperial Navy, going through specific ships, going through the actual doctrines of how the ships were meant to function, how the Navy saw ship warfare, why they designed the ships the way they did, and yeah, I think if you are a true bloody 40k fan, it might be fun to dive into these things. But anyway, that's about enough from me. TheStabbyBrit, signing out.